Welcome back to Playful Whimsies. Today, we're working on Chapter 2 of A Family Apart. It's part of the Orphan Train Adventures. Frances Mary Kelly ran into the cobbled street, carefully dodging between two polished and shining hansom cabs. Hurry! She had to hurry. Mr. Lomax, who managed the office building where Frances and Ma worked as scrub women, had given her an errand and told her to run. Usually he didn't complain, but the last time after he'd sent her to pick up a package, he had grumbled that she had dawdled and docked 10 cents from her weekly pay. She was terrified he'd do it again. The family needed every penny. Late September's warm weather had been swept away by a sudden chill wind from the north. Frances tightly clutched to her thin black shawl in one hand and the envelope Mr. Lomax had given her in the other. She darted forward across Fifth Avenue just as the huge, rambling, iron-wheeled rim of a cab dropped into a rut in the street in front of her, drenching the skirt of her faded brown dress and her bare feet with cold, muddy water. She jumped backward, crying out, "Watch where you're going!" The driver leaned from his high perch at the back of the cab, yelling and brandishing his whip. Shivering, her wet legs aching from the cold, Frances scrambled onto the sidewalk. 2 more blocks to go. Fighting back tears, she ran down the sidewalk, ducking in and out among the pedestrians until she came to her destination, a dark brick building with ornate cornices over the doors and windows. Frances shoved open the heavy paneled door and, after checking the names on the inner doors, found the right one and knocked. "Come in," a deep voice called. She pushed open the door, peered into a large, cluttered room. One wall was lined with bookshelves that were filled with dusty books bound in red, brown, and black leather. Frances gasped to see them all. Oh, if only she had so many books to read. "What do you want?" She whirled to face a bald, round gentleman who sat in a tall chair behind the desk that needed a good cleaning. An inkstand balanced precariously on top of a stack of scattered newspapers, and a greasy china plate which held a dried crust of bread and a scattering of cheese crumbs topped a stack of long green leather-bound books. Frances closed her eyes, inhaling the cheese's pungent odor. She'd had potatoes, cabbage, and sausage her brother Mike had brought home at noon, but her stomach rumbled hungry. There wasn't ever enough food to stop that. The carpet was warm, and she curled and uncurled her bare toes against it. Ma was putting aside as much as she could to buy shoes for everyone for the winter, but the cold had come early this year, and there wasn't enough money for shoes yet. "Speak up," the man ordered. Frances' eyes blew and open in fright. What would happen to her job if the gentleman told Lummox that he'd been obliged to speak to her twice? "I'm sorry, sir. Are you Mr. Waterfield?" "Of course I am," he muttered. "What business do you have with me?" Resentful that she had no choice but to be polite to this hoary horrible grease-lipped person. She thrust the envelope towards him, and he half rose from his chair to snatch it. His vest strained to stay fastened over his stomach, and one of the buttons had popped. To keep herself from staring, Frances looked down at the floor. A crumpled newspaper lay near her toes. She picked it up and skimmed the headlines. Discussion of treaty with China. Lady Elgin sunk. 400 lives lost. From Missouri, Mr. M. Harbor, Lexington, newspaper publisher, was run out of town by 15 pro-slavery men and his printing office destroyed. An advertisement offered The Life of Abraham Lincoln by Illinois Republican who knows well the man and his history, a compact pamphlet, 4 cents a copy, addressed the Tribune office, Tribune Building, New York. Abraham Lincoln was running for President of the United States, and the voting would be next month. Dad had admired the man and told her about him, how she would love to read that pamphlet. Frances blurted out, "Sir, if you no longer want this newspaper, may I have it?" Mr. Waterfield raised his head from the letter he was reading to scowl at her. "That newspaper is of no use to me, but just what did you think you'd do with it?" Frances stood as tall and straight as she could. "Stupid man, what did he think she would do?" "I would read it," she said firmly. He laughed loudly, then jeered. "Read it? Ha! As if you urchins could read. Toss it over there in that basket." He reached for the inkwell and soon was penning an answer to Mr. Lennox's letter. "I hate you," Frances thought, as she followed his order. "You're a fat, horrible bully. Who are you to decide whether I can or can't read? You don't know me." She clenched her fists, wishing she could speak the words aloud. She still treasured the memory of when she was a very little girl and Dad had held her on his lap, the newspaper before them. "What's this word?" she'd ask, pointing. "And this one?" she'd insist as soon as he answered. "And this one?" "Ah, Frances Mary," Dad had said one day, "I think you're after learning to read." She had nodded vigorously. "Teach me to read, Da," she had begged, so he did. She loved to read and was proud of her reading because it was pleasing to Da. Since they were unable to afford clothes or books, sending that sending the little ones to school demanded, Frances had tried to pass on her father's teaching to the others. Mike had learned eagerly, gulping in the words as hungrily as he gulped in food at supper. Danny had learned too, following Mike's example, but after a few mistakes, Megan had hung back, unsure of herself, and could read very little. Mr. Waterfield suddenly stood up, breaking into Frances's thoughts. He tucked his sheet of paper into the envelope and held it out. "Get this answer to Mr. Lummox right away," he snapped, "and no dawdling." "Yes, sir," Frances said, still furious. She took the envelope, threw open the door, and ran down the hallway to the street. She walked briskly this time, able to notice the people around her. There were gentlemen dressed in ankle-length topcoats that swung around their legs as they walked. Many of them wore top hats and carried canes, some with heads of polished silver. The women wore long coats or capes that covered their full skirts almost to the hems. Most wore gloves, but a few had tucked their hands inside fur muffs. Tilted over their forehead were hats, decorated with silken flowers and tied under their chin with matching ribbons. A woman brushed past, sweeping her skirts out of the way. Her snake-waisted bottle green coat was fastened by a row of jet black buttons that wrinkled and winked and sparkled as they caught the light. Wouldn't Ma with her red hair look grand in a coat like that? Thought Frances in her mind. She could see her mother, tall and elegant, with the skirt of her coat swirling regally around her legs as she walked. Frances ached as she thought of patched, Ma's patched and faded clothes and shabby shawl. She wished with all her heart she could buy a bottle green coat for her mother. But she knew that a coat like that would cost her more than all the money she made in a month. Near the intersection of Fifth and Broadway, Frances nearly bumped into a girl her own size who was looking into a shop window. The girl wore a flared pale blue velvet coat and matching bonnet, and her hands were tucked into a white fur muff. "Look, Ma," said the girl to the woman who stood next to her. "Look at the doll in the pink dress." Frances looked too, at a doll with a creamy china face and blue glass eyes, dressed in a pink silk dress, made with dozens of tiny tucks and pleats and trimmed with ribbon rosettes. Frances gasped aloud. Oh, the wonder of her!